The arrival of Captain Riley. The Viraxian docking bay gleamed under the harsh lights of orbital station Kelthrix. 12 sleek, silver-blue fighters stood in perfect formation, their crystalline cockpits catching the light like enormous faceted gems. Commander Felix stood at attention, his 4 arms clasped behind his back, iridescent scales shifting from purple to deep blue as he surveyed his elite pilots of Nebula Squadron. "The human arrives today," Felix announced, his voice resonating with the natural harmonic undertones of his species. Captain Aidan Riley of the Terran Space Force. Lieutenant Varix, his second in command, flicked her sensory tendrils in obvious displeasure. "Why do we need training from a human? Our pilots are the finest in the Galactic Coalition. Alliance Command believes the human flying techniques will give us an edge against the Scourge," Felix replied, though his tone suggested he shared her skepticism. "Their pilots reportedly employ methods that our neural processors consider counterintuitive." The Viraxians had joined the Galactic Coalition only 30 cycles ago, after thousands of years of isolation. Their species had evolved from aquatic predators, developing technology that mirrored their precise, calculated hunting patterns. Their neural architecture processed flight data differently than most species, allowing them to execute maneuvers with mathematical perfection. A small transport ship eased through the energy field separating the bay from open space. It was unremarkable, even ugly by Viraxian standards. A boxy Earth-made craft with visible weld marks and practical, unpolished surfaces. The transport settled on the deck with a gentle hiss of stabilizers. After a moment, the hatch slid open, and Captain Aidan Riley stepped out. He was shorter than most Viraxians, with dark skin and close-cropped black hair. His flight suit was worn at the edges, patched in several places, and adorned with patches showing Earth, the Terran Space Force insignia, and a personal emblem, a phoenix rising from flames. "Commander Felix," Riley called out, approaching with an easy stride and extended hand. "Captain Aidan Riley, at your service." Felix regarded the human's hand briefly before remembering the Terran greeting custom. He extended his upper right arm and grasped Riley's hand carefully. "Welcome to Kelthrix Station, Captain. Nebula Squadron awaits your instruction." The slight pause betrayed his doubt. Riley grinned, seemingly oblivious to the tension. "Great-looking ships you've got here. The VX-900 Starblades, right? I've read the specs, but never seen one in person." He walked over to the nearest fighter, running his hand appreciatively along its smooth hull. "Crystalline propulsion matrix, neutrino dampening shields, psycho-reactive controls. Beautiful machines. They are the pinnacle of Viraxian engineering," Felix said stiffly. "Our pilots trained for 15 years before qualifying for active duty." "Impressive," Riley nodded. "Mind if I take one for a spin? Best way for me to understand what I'm working with." Felix's scales flashed red with surprise. "These craft are synchronized to Viraxian neural patterns. I doubt a human cold." "I've flown 17 different alien craft designs," Riley interrupted, his expression suddenly serious, "including a Dralaxian mineship that actively tried to reject me. Trust me, I can handle it." After a moment's hesitation, Felix nodded curtly. "Very well. Lieutenant Varix will prepare a flight plan for." "No need," Riley said, already climbing the access ladder to the nearest Starblade. "Just give me an open vector and enough space to put her through her paces." The Viraxian pilots exchanged glances, their scales shifting to shades of amusement and disbelief. Lieutenant Varix leaned toward Felix. "This should be entertaining. At least." Within minutes, Riley had powered up the fighter. The crystalline cockpit sealed around him, and the Starblade rose smoothly from the deck, hovering as its systems initialized. "Nebula Control, this is Riley. Requesting departure clearance and an open testing space within sensor range of the station." "Clearance granted, Captain," came the controller's voice. "Testing Zone Alpha 7 is available. Minimum safe distance from the station is maintained at 5 kilometers." Copy that. Riley out. The star blade glided forward, passing through the energy barrier and into open space. For a moment, it moved with the precise, measured grace typical of Viraxian piloting. Then everything changed. Riley flipped the fighter end over end in a maneuver that made the watching Viraxians flinch. He executed a tight spiral, engines flaring as he pushed the craft to accelerations that approached redline. The starblade screamed through a series of corkscrew turns, barrel rolls, and knife-edge passes that seemed to defy both physics and logic. In the control room, Felix and his pilots watched in stunned silence. The human was flying their premier fighter craft in ways they had never conceived possible, pushing systems to limits the Viraxians would never approach. "That's impossible," whispered Varix, her scales paling to a shocked white. "The inertial compensators should have failed 3 maneuvers ago." "He's redlining the crystalline matrix," another pilot noted, watching the telemetry. "The containment field is fluctuating, but it's holding. Somehow." After 15 minutes of increasingly improbable aerobatics, Riley guided the Starblade back to the docking bay and settled it gently onto its designated pad. The crystalline cockpit unsealed, and he climbed down, looking decidedly pleased with himself. "Beautiful ship," he said, approaching the gathered Viraxians. "Responds like a dream once you get a feel for it. A bit too conservative on the safety protocols, but I can work with that." Felix's scales had settled into a deep, thoughtful blue. "Your demonstration was unorthodox, Captain." "That's why I'm here," Riley replied. "Orthodox flying gets you killed against the scourge. They don't follow patterns or protocols. They fight with instinct and aggression. And you propose to teach my squadron to fly like that?" Felix gestured toward the fighter. "Not exactly like that," Riley smiled. "But I'm going to teach them to fly beyond their programming, to trust their instincts even when their computers say it's impossible." Over the next several days, Riley's training sessions challenged everything the Viraxians thought they knew about space combat. He had them run simulations with degraded sensors, damaged systems, and against overwhelming odds. He disabled safety protocols, forcing them to rely on instinct rather than computer assistance. Many of the Viraxian pilots struggled. Their neural architecture, evolved for precision and calculation, resisted the improvisation Riley demanded. Some became frustrated, others dismissive. Lieutenant Varix, however, began to adapt, her flying becoming more fluid, less predictable. "Your species thinks of space as an ocean," Riley explained during an evening briefing. "You navigate it with precision, following currents and patterns. That's your strength, but also your weakness." "And how do humans see space?" Felix asked, genuinely curious despite his lingering skepticism. "We see it as freedom," Riley answered. "Infinite possibilities, limited only by imagination and courage. We don't just navigate space, we dance with it." "Dancing will not defeat the scourge," one of the pilots muttered. "No," Riley agreed seriously, "but thinking beyond what your enemy expects might. The scourge have studied your traditional tactics. They're counting on you to fly by the book. Your book. We're going to write a new one." By the end of the week, tension in the squadron had reached a breaking point. Half the pilots had embraced Riley's methods, while the others clung to their traditional training. Felix found himself caught between loyalty to Viraxian tradition and the undeniable effectiveness of Riley's unorthodox approach. "Your methods are divisive, Captain," Felix told Riley as they reviewed simulation results in his office. "Change always is," Riley replied calmly, "but your pilots are improving. Look at these scores. Varix has increased her kill ratio by 30%. At the cost of increased risk to herself and potentially to her wingmates," Felix countered. "Viraxian combat doctrine emphasizes squadron cohesion and coordinated attacks." Riley leaned forward. "Commander, with respect, that doctrine was developed before you encountered the scourge. They fight like rabid animals, unpredictable, vicious. Traditional formations just give them bigger targets. Before Thelix could respond, the station alarm blared. A communications officer's voice crackled over the intercom. All pilots to stations. Scourge vessels detected approaching colony Helios. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Thelix rose immediately. It seems, Captain Riley, that your methods will face a trial by fire sooner than expected. Riley nodded grimly. Time to see if your pilots can dance when the music turns deadly. Trial by fire. The pilots of Nebula Squadron raced to their fighters as the alarm continued to wail throughout Kelthrix Station. Colony Helios, only 30 minutes away at maximum speed, was home to over 20,000 civilian Viraxians. If the Scourge reached it before they did, the death toll would be catastrophic. Commander Thelix strode alongside Captain Riley, his scales a determined shade of deep red. You'll observe from the command ship, he told the human flatly. With respect, Commander, I'm flying, Riley replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. I didn't come all this way to sit on the sidelines when it matters. Thelix hesitated only briefly before nodding. Take Varix's wingmate position. She's adapted best to your methods. Perhaps the two of you can demonstrate their effectiveness. Within minutes, the 12 star blades of Nebula Squadron launched into space, joined by Riley in a 13th fighter. They formed up in their traditional arrowhead pattern and accelerated toward the Helios colony. All pilots, this is Commander Thelix. Long-range sensors show 8 Scourge vessels approaching Helios. They appear to be Hunter-class ships with 1 command vessel. Standard Engagement Protocol Alpha 3. Permission to speak, Commander. Riley's voice came over the comm. Granted, Captain. The Scourge will expect Alpha 3. They've seen it before. I suggest we split the squadron. Half follow standard protocol as a diversion. Half approach from below the ecliptic plane using the maneuvers we've practiced. A tense silence followed. The Viraxian pilots awaited their commander's decision. Your suggestion has merit. Thelix finally responded. Pilots 1 through 6 will execute Alpha 3. 7 through 12. Follow Captain Riley's lead. Lieutenant Varix has tactical command of the second group. As they approached the Helios system, the Scourge vessels came into visual range. They were ugly, asymmetrical craft that resembled thorned sea creatures, organic-looking despite being mechanical. Their movements were erratic and unpredictable, darting and spinning without apparent pattern. Scourge detected, Thelix announced. Engage as planned. May the cosmic currents guide your paths. The first group of Viraxian fighters accelerated directly toward the Scourge in their perfect formation. As predicted, the enemy ships immediately moved to intercept, spreading out to envelop the approaching Viraxians. Meanwhile, Riley led his group in a wide arc beneath the plane of engagement. Cut engines to minimal thrust, he instructed. Let momentum carry us. Minimal energy signatures until my mark. The 6 fighters glided silently through space, using the dim light of a distant gas giant for cover. The Scourge, focused on the obvious threat of Thelix's group, failed to detect them. Above, the battle had begun in earnest. The Viraxian fighters executed their attack with precision, their formation breaking into smaller pairs that engaged the Scourge with coordinated fire. But the Scourge vessels were wickedly fast, their movements seemingly random, making them difficult targets despite the Viraxians' superior firepower. Now, Riley called, and his group's engines flared to life. They rocketed upward toward the battle, appearing suddenly on the Scourge's sensors from an unexpected vector. Remember your training, Riley said as they closed in. Don't fly like computers, fly like predators. Unpredictable, aggressive. Each of you pick a target and stay on it no matter what. Varix, you and I are going for the command ship. The 6 fighters broke formation, each veering off in a different direction. The Scourge, suddenly facing attacks from multiple angles, began to lose their coordination. Riley and Varix dove toward the Scourge command vessel, a larger, more heavily armed version of the Hunter ships. It immediately turned its main weapons toward them, firing a barrage of energy pulses. Split and spiral. Riley called, banking his fighter sharply right while Varix went left. They corkscrewed around the incoming fire, approaching the command ship from opposite sides. The Scourge vessel rotated, trying to track both targets, but couldn't match their erratic flight patterns. Riley pushed his fighter to its limits, executing a maneuver that brought him skimming along the Scourge ship's hull, firing his weapons point-blank into its sensor arrays. Across the battlefield, the other Viraxian pilots began to adapt. Seeing the effectiveness of Riley's approach, even Thalix's group started breaking from their rigid patterns, their movements becoming more fluid and unpredictable. A Scourge hunter locked onto Thalix's fighter, pursuing him relentlessly. The commander found himself cornered, with the Scourge vessel closing rapidly from behind. "Commander, cut engines and flip 180, Riley shouted over the comm. Without hesitation, Thalix did exactly that. His fighter seemed to hang motionless for a split second before rotating to face his pursuer, who flew directly into his line of fire. A burst of energy from Thalix's weapons tore through the surprised Scourge vessel. "Well executed, Commander," Riley called, a note of approval in his voice. The tide of battle had turned. The Viraxian fighters, blending their precise coordination with Riley's unpredictable tactics, systematically dismantled the Scourge attack force. 7 of the 8 enemy vessels were destroyed or disabled. Only the command ship remained, still engaged with Riley and Varix. Despite its damaged sensors, it fought ferociously, launching a spread of proximity mines that forced both fighters to break off their attack. "I can't get a clear shot," Varix reported, her fighter weaving through the minefield. "I have an idea," Riley responded, "but it's risky. Remember the Tycho slide we practiced? That maneuver has a 37% chance of pilot mortality." Varix replied immediately. "Only if you calculate it," Riley laughed. "Trust your instincts, not your computer. Follow my lead." Riley's fighter dove directly toward the command ship, flying straight at its main weapons array. The Scourge vessel concentrated fire on him, energy beams lancing through space where his fighter had been moments before as he juked and rolled unpredictably. Varix followed behind him, matching his erratic pattern but offset by several degrees. As they closed in, Riley suddenly cut his engines and deployed his fighter's emergency braking system. His star blade decelerated violently, dropping below the Scourge ship's line of fire. In that same instant, Varix accelerated, using the space Riley had cleared to launch a perfectly aimed torpedo directly into the command vessel's exposed power core. She pulled up sharply, her fighter barely clearing the explosion that consumed the Scourge ship. "All targets neutralized," Thalix announced, his voice steady despite the intensity of the battle. "Nebula Squadron, form up and return to Kelthrix. Colony Helios is secure." As they regrouped, the Viraxian pilots' communications filled with excited chatter, a rare break from their usual disciplined silence. They had faced the dreaded Scourge and emerged victorious, with no losses. Back at Kelthrix Station, the mood was one of triumph tinged with reflection. The squadron gathered in the briefing room, scales shimmering with colors of excitement and pride. Commander Thalix stood before them, Captain Riley at his side. "Today," Thalix began, "Nebula Squadron wrote a new chapter in Viraxian combat history. For centuries, we have believed that perfection lies in precision, in calculations, in following established patterns." He turned to Riley. "Captain Riley has shown us that there is power in unpredictability, in trusting what humans call instinct. The Scourge expected us to fly as we always have, as our training dictated. Instead, we adapted. We evolved." Riley stepped forward. "What you did today wasn't about flying like humans. It was about taking the best of both approaches. Viraxian precision combined with human improvisation created something neither of our species could achieve alone." Lieutenant Varix, her scales a contemplative blue-green, spoke up. "Our ancestors evolved as hunters in the deep oceans of Virax. They did not rely solely on calculation. They also possessed instinct, The ability to adapt to prey that didn't follow predictable patterns. Perhaps what you've taught us, Captain, is to reclaim something we had forgotten. Felix nodded. There is wisdom in that perspective, Lieutenant. He extended all four of his arms toward Riley in the traditional Viraxian gesture of profound respect. The Alliance was right to send you, Captain Riley. Your methods may be unorthodox, but they have proven their worth in combat. Riley smiled, returning the gesture as best he could with his two arms. This is just the beginning. Imagine what your pilots will accomplish once they fully integrate both approaches, the mathematical precision of Viraxian flying with the creative instinct of human pilots. As the briefing concluded, Riley found himself surrounded by Viraxian pilots eager to discuss the battle, analyze their maneuvers, and plan future training sessions. The initial skepticism had vanished, replaced by genuine respect and curiosity. Commander Felix approached Riley as the group dispersed. There is an old Viraxian saying, he said quietly. The current may guide you, but sometimes you must swim against it to find new waters. We have a similar saying on Earth, Riley replied. Sometimes you have to break the rules to make new ones. Felix's scales rippled with amusement. Perhaps our species are not so different after all. As they looked out the viewport at the stars beyond, both the human test pilot and the alien commander knew that this was more than just a successful mission. It was the beginning of a partnership that would change the way both their species approached the art of flight, and perhaps the first step toward a deeper understanding between two very different civilizations united by the boundless frontier of space.